changing world of work, what's the so what for us as HR practitioners, as leaders, and indeed as employees? My piece of that is going to be talking about this area of Agile HR and indeed looking at then the individual implications of that. My own journey with it, I guess, started with this question really, which is what I kind of do on a broader basis, is around sense-making of this thing called future of work, the greatest mirage in history, as far as I'm concerned. I guess when you're working in it for some time, you kind of go, it's always just ahead of you. It's like a mirage where what is it? And there is no formal definition of the future of work. It doesn't exist as anything in particular. It's just a label of convenience for everything, from robotics to artificial intelligence to generations at work, all those forces and changes that we've been talking about this morning. I guess it's a lazy label, if you like, for all of that. But at the heart of it, though, there is something that we need to be aware of, and we've just been talking about it. There is something profound happening at the same time as these sort of forces of technology and consumer demand and globalization all kind of seem to be coming in on a perfect storm. There is some fundamental stuff. So one of my parts of my work is to unpack that, to peel back the onion, to really kind of challenge people and to get an understanding of what's the so what, especially in HR. We can't just go to seminars about future of work and hear about how the world might be, etc. We need to get into the detail of it, to peel back the layers for our organizations, for our leaders, for our employees, to really get to the heart of what matters for us in our context and what will help to future-proof our organizations, our teams, and our employees in the world of work. That's kind of a mission I think that we have to take on. So while others might, talk about the future of work and what it might be conceptually, we have to get into the heart of it. And one of the practical realities that is definitely true when you peel back the onion, so to speak, is this question of complexity. And we've been hearing about it this morning, that with the pace of change that I've been talking about, but also increased complexity, uncertainty, lack of consensus, if you like, about the options. It used to be, perhaps you might say, in sort of 20th century world, that we had time to consider those options, and it became a linear process, and we had linear structures, linear ways of doing things. We could plan and control our way. There was such thing as a 5-year strategy. Who's heard of a 5-year strategy recently? A 5-year vision, maybe. But I think strategies are much shorter term now in terms of understanding what we're going to do in the next couple of years. So we are faced with this reality. This is one of the realities that in HR we've got to deal with. And I think for HR it poses some challenges too, because we've been working and we've been asked by our organizations, and the pressure has been on us to live and work in a plan and control way. Come up with systems, processes, repeatable, consistent, compliance, legal, unions, works councils, all of these things that we're used to, global compensation plans. We've been kind of in this kind of world of plan and control, consistency. But now we are faced with the reality that we are in complex times. And my challenge is that we're not all necessarily, everything's moved in here, but we've got to work with both. We still need consistency. We still need some rules of the game, some principles to keep things stable, but we also need to be able to deal with complexity in a more deliberate way than we have, not just in episodes that come from time to time over the years. So dealing with this complexity, and I'm afraid it's not the first time you've heard it this morning, but it is true that people will talk about how do you deal with that complexity. Well, agility then comes into play. And it's the most common responses that you hear. People say, well, we need to be more agile. So when it gets to agility, I mean, one of the ways I tend to think about it is the skier. We're now into hopefully ski season for some folks this part of the world, particularly not where I come from. But that idea of a skier has to be in the present and has to navigate obstacles in the here and now, but also has to be able to have some capacity to look up and scan where they are moving to so they don't go over a cliff or that they end up in the right place. So it's a very disciplined thing. It's not a chaotic discipline. It's actually very disciplined, and you need the right equipment and you need the right skills. but it's both dealing with the present and the future. And I think it's a helpful analogy or whatever that I use to talk about agility. The issue for us, of course, is we're moving from, organizationally, we're moving from being in the green slope to probably red. The sense and the need for us to do this at pace now is coming upon us. And when you get into it and decode it, and we're not going to go through these, but one of the things, agility needs to be seen at a number of levels. It's no use us working at team level and it not happening at organizational level, for instance. Or if it's not part of the strategy, maybe then we don't need to be agile. But if agility is required, it has to appear somewhere on the leadership agenda. So agility takes all these forms, and I'm going to touch on the HR and the personal one today, rather than going through all of these. But just by way of example, I was working with an organization who were going through a digital transformation, talking about this issue. So where they were going towards digital transformation, big strategy, the usual story, going from analog to digital, much more serious amount of demands from customers, etc., and working with the technology area. And what they had done was at team level, they were knocking it out of the park. They had adjusted their work practices, so they were super at the whole agile working kind of methodology. The traditional waterfall and linear way of working just was not suitable for their new ways of working, for the customer demand and the technology requirements. So they had figured that out at team level. But what they were finding was they were having problems upstream, because the organization at a higher level, there was like a headwind, or culturally, the organization wasn't supporting them in operating in that way. The decision-making processes, the governance processes, HR was actually a barrier rather than an enabler of agility in this particular case. And we had to get in to try to help that and broker that relationship. Performance management being a classic, that the teams were saying, crying out, please don't inflict this performance management process on us because it's simply not fit for purpose anymore. We don't have line managers in the same way as we do before. We don't have management by objectives. So help us and co-create a new way of managing performance, because we do need to do that, but not in the traditional way. And then other issues downstream at leadership level, team leaders and individuals not necessarily comfortable with the new way of working in this agile kind of way. So what became very clear was HR's pivotal place in enabling agility in an organization. It was absolutely clear that we control so many, or influence so many of the levers, the processes that influence agility, and therefore also, by definition, helping the organization being future of work ready. Because, and it's just adding to the list, isn't it, in terms of HR? So here we are now as agility enablers, on top of employee experience providers, talent builders, culture shapers. How many more roles can we take on? And isn't that one of the challenges that we have compared to some of our other professional colleagues, is the sheer scale and scope of our function, and what the expectations of us are in this changing world of work. And that has brought us to a question of the fact that we ourselves are going to have to look at how we work and how we operate as HR, because it's simply unsustainable for us to manage things in the plan and control way that we have done in the past. A bit like our software colleagues found in the late 90s. They could not cope with the change in the technology and the range of customer demands. So they had to change their kind of approach, their mindset. And so the Agile Manifesto was born in 2001. A set of principles to guide software development for the future, recognizing that the traditional linear waterfall methods weren't. So my challenge is HR facing that similar dilemma, in the sense that we are being pulled on to do so much. We have so much potential and so much of an important leadership role in shaping the future organization, enabling agility. It probably goes to show that we probably have to think about how we operate. And that is what Agile HR tries to talk about. And it tries to talk about a shift from maybe traditional HR to a different way of doing things. So, for instance, rather than prescribing and controlling, being more adaptive. Rather than thinking in terms of jobs and full-time equivalents, thinking in terms of skills and tasks and projects where automation and other things and AI and gig working can, for instance, can support us. Instead of delivering programs to customers, which is probably our comfort zone, we're now into the world of co-creating programs and solutions with our customers, taking the pressure off ourselves perhaps and putting some of the monkey on the back of the business, for instance, and putting some of the onus on them to be involved, like that IT example I gave you. And indeed thinking about, rather than being fully au fait with technical precision, moving to experimentation. And the idea of being comfortable with not getting it right first time, rather than waiting for everything to be perfect before we launch. So these are some of the kind of themes that we're seeing all the time in HR, and I'm sure those of you who are in this space already can see it. My only problem with this slide is I don't think it's an either or. I think, unfortunately, the ambidextrous nature of HR is we're going to have both. There are situations where we need plan and control. We need these good disciplines and mechanics to our profession, but we need to be able to, at the right time, move into this more flexible, experimental, adaptable, co-creating kind of space. And that's, for me, what HR, Agile HR, is about. People tend to focus on the methods and the principles and the practices, but actually it really starts with the mindset. And openness to change and adapt is probably the biggest thing. And then we can talk about principles like co-creation, experimentation, that come into play. And then, of course, practices. And it doesn't mean that Agile HR has to exist for the whole suite. It could be that some of these things are best left in the plan and control box, if you like, while other things we can really go at. Unions, for instance, might determine that we can't touch the reward system as much as we'd like, but it doesn't mean we can't do recognition and feedback and performance management in a different way, or indeed onboarding, or how we select people. So it's about picking battles and where in the HR life cycle this approach might work and might be most suitable. Because there's no doubt that, for instance, you take something like recruitment. People find that kind of an easy place, taking the Kanban type of approach to visualize the process flow. It's getting more and more common now. Rather than individual steps happening in isolation, actually let's try and see the whole flow and understand where bottlenecks might be. Because 6 months is just not good enough anymore for critical roles to be filled in an organization. We have to rethink how we can fill those spots. Can we shrink the process or supplement it with gig working and platforms, talent platforms, etc.? So rethinking recruitment. Onboarding is another very easy one to take on, and bringing design thinking and design principles into play, mapping out the user experience from the very minute they engage with your brand online, to interview, to selection, to onboarding, mapping that whole process. Where are the highs, where are the lows in that process, and maximizing the highs and minimizing the lows, using good techniques from user design and onboarding, taking on the difficult child of HR, performance management, as a friend has coined it, that seems to keep on coming up and biting us. But take it on. The Agile mindset says take it on. Acknowledge there's an issue. Come up with a new solution that's more dynamic, maybe not as systemized and perfect as it was, but something that's more real. Another area then, of course, as well as HR looking at itself in terms of its processes, it's about HR then taking those skills of agility and agile working, taking that to the business, to really sit with the business and say, right, you folks are trying to come up with new agile ways of working in your business, whether it's IT, product development, marketing. We will work with you now as partners in that to see where are the people issues with your new flows and your new systems. What are the people bottlenecks? What are the areas in which we can help you make those flows better and make it work? Because certainly in some of the organizations I've been working with, HR is just a little bit reticent about going in there, going into the bear pit of the agile working teams. And as a result, there's a sort of an us and them kind of atmosphere. But the issue is when you talk to these folks, 60, 70% of their issues are people issues. So we've got to embrace this challenge. So these are just some of the ways, and the practical ways in which Agile HR is presenting itself. And what those folks who have been there would say, and I'd be very interested to hear comments from people, is the idea of thinking big, really going for it in terms of a concept and a philosophy and a mindset, but acting small, acting safe. Pick your battles. Where is there a need? Where is there an opportunity? And going after that. and just being consistent then in the application of these principles. It doesn't have to be a big bang. That's the whole point. It's about a more lighting fires around the organization and building up capability and capacity as you go. What I'd like to just finish up with and move on to is the implications of all this at individual level. So we've talked about agility, I guess, as an organizational concept. We've tried to delayer the onion a little bit to see, well, as HR, we don't have the luxury to poo-poo it and let it go. We've got to deal with it, confront it, understand it, acknowledge it, and work with our leaders to make it happen. We've talked a little bit about the implications for HR itself, looking at its own function. But one of the things we've been working on too is the individual. And we've been hearing this morning about the stresses and strains of modern working life on individuals. I referred to it a bit earlier. We've been hearing that, well, we want people to be flexible and adaptable. We talked about the human interdependence this morning with Mark. And so what we've been working on is, well, what about that individual? What are the qualities now associated with the modern employee, with the employee of the future? What are the softer qualities? We know about digital and all the technical skills that people need, but what about the softer skills that need to be more front of mind and deliberate, if you like, amongst individuals? So we looked at this and we simply asked. Well, we went out and did research both with business leaders, HR leaders, teams, matched that too with the academic research, and came up with a model, which is the first time it's been shown actually at a conference, is this personal agility model. The idea being that if we can start to hire and give people a sense of what these qualities are, we're going to enable them to be able to deal with this changing world of work and to thrive in it rather than just cope with it, because it seems to be there's a lot of coping going on. Is there a lot of thriving? So that was the kind of essence of it, to try to get underneath that. So we asked, what are the qualities most associated with individual or personal agility? And won't surprise you. Some of these won't surprise you at all. But that learning mindset was one. This openness to learning, this openness to try new things rather than being fixed in what I've learned. The growth mindset idea. Being learning orientated, creative and resourceful. The idea, of course, of being more comfortable with change, having a change orientation, being positive and actually welcoming change rather than kind of resisting it. But also what we heard about this morning too was resilience. That idea of being able to change, but at a pace and at a way that's sustainable for me. So change ability, if you want to call it like that. The empowered point was hugely important, and we've heard about that too this morning. From Andique as well, talked about that human kind of connection, that human autonomy, Dan Pink, etc. We've been talking about this. But that idea of maximizing the empowerment environment, but also checking in with people whether they want to be empowered. There's this assumption that, people want to be empowered. Actually, it's not so. Some people don't necessarily want too much empowerment. There is this term of psychological empowerment, which is trying to get at what is the level in which I'm happy to take on more. Because sometimes people say, yeah, I'll take on more, but actually, secretly, they're not. Actually. So we need to acknowledge that in this changing world of work, because there's a lot of things going on in the surface. And then there is the human piece that we talked about this morning too, the relationship management, that ability to be able to network, to connect, to be able to say no, to be able to call things out, to be able to handle conflict, and indeed the collaborative piece. So these became the skills, and one of the most compelling things which we didn't foresee, but that came out in all the research and the interviews that we took, was this point about being purposeful. I know it's the millionth time you've heard it this morning, but it was quite compelling how this came through primary research, not just an idea or a concept. Was that the examples of agility, individual agility, the business leaders and HR leaders came, they were all talking about there was something in the individual's attitude. There was something that they were up to something. They were trying to make something better. They were trying to make it better for the client or for the patient. Or they were trying to get ahead for themselves. It didn't really matter. The idea was that there was a purpose to what they were about as individuals that drove them through the issues that were there in terms of the barriers to their work. So when you looked at that a little bit deeper, you could start to see actually there's some individual things that we have total control over as individuals, and then other things that are more about the social or the environment that we're in. So we started to look at that, and with colleagues developed a radar in which would be able to give people an assessment, looking in the mirror, in other words, of where they were and against some of these qualities, and where they might be against their team, for instance. Just to start the conversation going with, how agile are you? How future fit are you in terms of your career and in how you're dealing with day-to-day struggles and day-to-day challenges of modern work today? So that's just a kind of a taste of what that looks like. So that's just it from me, and I just think when I put all this together in terms of the HR piece or the individual piece, I just think what an amazing opportunity we have. Not just to enable agility in our organizations and make them more successful, but also to prepare leaders and individuals for this thing that we call the future of work.